welcome back to Geek Warning, everybody. I'm Kaylee Fretz. I'm here with Dave Rome and James Wong. Ronan is taking a well-deserved week off after a very long, hard, sleepless trip to the classics last week. We've got a lot to chat about today. We're going to be getting into some of the catastrophic tire failures at Paris-Roubaix last weekend. There's been lots of questions about this. We're going to chat a little more about some of the Campagnolo rumors and facts that we've got now. We mentioned this on a previous episode. We're going to get into a bit about a thermoplastic wheel brand. James has been riding these things. We'll get into those later in the show as well. And then some new Trek road helmets, some grid skin clothing, some new Garmins. We got a whole bunch of news for you this week. We're going to get into all of it in today's Geek Warning. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And welcome, James.
Hi, Kaylee. There's a lot of dog barking going on upstairs here.
I was wondering if that was at your house or
that's at my house.
I can't really tell.
Those are my two very loud dogs.
That's all right. Well, let's kick off. Let's jump right into this. Let's jump into kind of the story of the moment, I guess, even though it is a couple days old now. Some of the catastrophic tire failures at Paris-Roubaix. We had a lot of questions about this pop up, like in our Twitter feed and Instagram feeds and things like that, particularly after was it an Israel Premier Tech rider, I believe, that had a particularly catastrophic front wheel kind of explosion that happened on the Arenberg.
That was one of them.
That was one of many. I should say that, like, so James, Ronan and I and Johnny were at the exit of the Arenberg. We're kind of like, we were standing where all the mechanics and soigneurs and things wait at the exit. And it wasn't any more broken stuff than you see there in a particular year. But there was, as always, a pretty large heap of broken stuff. So, James, I think we wanted to address this and kind of dig into what people were seeing, right?
Yeah. I think certainly in social media, there's been this, I'd say, perception. I think I'm going to call it a perception because we don't necessarily have like hard facts, but there's been a perception that because most of the men's peloton in particular had switched to tubeless tires instead of tubulars, and based on some of the stuff that we saw on TV watching the race, there's definitely a perception that tubeless tires have been more prone to failure than tubulars. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because a couple of things. First of all, the reason why teams have moved to tubeless tires over tubulars is basically just for rolling resistance reasons, because there's all this data now showing that they're faster, and the teams they want to go faster. Like year after year, the finish times at Roubaix keep getting shorter and shorter. I mean, you could argue that riders are getting fitter and faster, but you could more easily argue that the bikes are getting faster. So that is why teams have moved over to tubeless in the first place. But as far as all of these apparent tire failure sort of thing, again, without having actually a mole inside the team, but knowing how tubeless tires work, we have a couple of things that we're looking at here. One, we have to remember that Paris-Roubaix is so far and away from any sort of normal riding environment for these types of bikes. It's just such an incredibly fringe case. It's just completely bizarre. No one in their right mind typically would be riding stuff like this, like these people do. So that being said, at the pressures that these people are riding these tires at, tubeless road tires in particular, they're tight on the rim. And with the way tubeless tire rims are shaped now, it's generally pretty hard to get a tubeless tire off the rim, even when it's flat. So I want to get that out of the way first and foremost. So while it is very possible that at very, very low pressures, you could burp a tire and just have the whole thing just blow out, I think what has been far more likely is that an Arenberg, it's no matter what you do and no matter how well you engineer the wheel, if you're running a carbon wheel, you are going to smash into a cobble, you are going to break a wheel. Now, when this happened with tubulars, it wasn't as visually dramatic because the tires were glued onto the rim. That rim could be cracked in 6 places and that tire would presumably still be stuck on there for the most part. But with a tubeless setup, when you have a rim failure, as soon as you have a compromise in that tire bed circumference, it's all over.
Yeah. I was going to say that this outside of Paris-Roubaix is commonly seen in downhill World Cups, for example. In practice and in qualifying, you'll see multiple riders come down every single day with a tire wrapped around their frame in some regard that's kind of come unstuck from the wheel, from a wheel failure. So it's really, I guess that reinforces James's point, which is it's a very common failure mode if the rim fails, if you hit a large enough rock strike. And obviously that rim failure mode presents itself at Roubaix more than any other event in road cycling, and is probably the one example in road cycling where we see such rock damage done to rims. So yeah, for me, there wasn't anything too peculiar about what we were seeing, because it's just so common in other disciplines of cycling.
I mean, it's the primary reason why Roubaix was one of the last races to get a lot of tubeless, right? It was about half a year behind, because the concern was that you couldn't ride the wheels flat, or you couldn't ride the tires flat. I do think that the inserts have certainly helped that, and there were a lot of teams running inserts this year. Ronan and I were kind of wandering around trying to figure out who exactly was on them, but Christophe Laporte is a perfect example. We're pretty sure he was on inserts, and I watched him come out of the Armberg Forest with a flat rear tire and take the left-hand corner at the exit of that, which they're still going very fast, took that corner with a completely flat tubeless tire with a insert in it, and didn't fall down, didn't rip a tire off, was essentially able to ride it almost like it was like a tubular. So I do think that that's a solution that we'll probably see more and more and more of at Roubaix. Probably not so much on the rest of professional road racing, but I was actually kind of genuinely shocked that we didn't see more of it this year. There's not a whole lot of downside. And yeah, it brings back into the equation that sort of special ability that tubulars have, which is you can ride them even when they're toast.
So, but anyway, point being that I think people are looking for some like super dramatic or like, gotcha sort of thing that they can pin on tubeless or hookless or whatever. And I personally just don't think it's there. I think it's just the sort of thing where when those things fail catastrophically, it's a lot more visually dramatic. And again, just by virtue of the fact that the tire is not glued onto the rim, when you have an actual rim failure, then, well, you're done. But again, given one area, taking another area, but I don't think the riders are going to be going back to tubulars anytime soon, even after some of the wheel failures that we saw this year. I think it's just going to be this sort of thing where wheels just continue to get better.
And their setups continue to get better, right? Like some of the teams that did have the failure where the tire came off the rim will probably be on inserts next year that'll increase that retention. And I know from speaking with a few mechanics in the World Tour that once you use a certain setup with an insert, those mechanics are now cutting the tire off the rim when that tire's done. They're not going through the effort of actually removing it, because it is actually quite difficult to remove. So wasteful,
just like tubulars.
Wasteful, but not any different to tubular in terms of the waste associated there. But it's some of these are a very secure fit.
All right, well let's move on from this, because again, like I said, Kaylee and Ronan are going to have a very big deep dive episode on Paris-Roubaix Tech, but that's just something I wanted to touch on at the beginning of the show, just because so many people have been asking about it. But that's where we stand on that. But moving on from there, we had reported, or I guess we've been talking a little bit about some Campagnolo patents. A contributor of ours, Alan Cote, he put an article up about some really interesting patents that he uncovered for Campagnolo, and it's been rumored for quite a while that Campy was going to move over to a wireless setup for their electronic stuff, which is good considering EPS is old. But I know in previous conversations that we've had about this, Ronan in particular was really bummed about the fact that Campagnolo seemed to have gotten rid of the thumb actuation for their shifter. And Ronan, Campagnolo has clearly heard you, because in the last 2 weeks, they have reversed course. Well, no, just kidding. We just didn't know enough about it back then. But what Alan has discovered is that there are a set of paddles on down by the brake lever where there normally would be for Campagnolo, but now there's 2 buttons there. So it's kind of Shimano-esque in that sense. But what he's discovered is there are still thumb buttons up top. So now you can do both. So now not only do you still have the thumb button, so it's very traditional camping in that sense, but now it's not going to be impossible to upshift when you're in the drops, as it is with Campy EPS at the moment. So that seems pretty good to me.
We're talking about buttons though, as versus a paddle, right?
It does appear to be buttons, yes.
Yeah.
But
can you like take the thumb button off or something?
It doesn't look like it. It looks like it's basically a button. So for anyone who is listening to this who has been around long enough to remember what was it called? Ergo Brain? Is that what it was called? I think it was Ergo Brain. Whatever Campagnolo's integrated computer thing was. Yeah. That computer was actuated with a little button on the inboard side of the shift lever body, and from what I can tell, the shift actuation on this new Campagnolo wireless setup is actually going to be kind of similar to that.
Shimano had a version of that as well, didn't they?
They did.
With the same placement of button.
Oh, dear God, what the heck was that called? I can't remember now.
Yeah. Anyway, it looks like, I'd imagine with the two buttons being there, you'd be able to configure what the buttons
flight
do.
deck. Thank you.
There you go.
This is why we do. We forgot to mention at the beginning of the recording here that we are once again doing this show in front of a live studio audience on the internet. And the nice thing about that is when we can't remember what something's called, our lovely members remind us. It's great.
Kaylee, can you talk a bit more about this live studio audience? How do you become a live member of the audience?
You reminded me to plug. I appreciate that. Well, all of our live studio audience here are members of Escape Collective. You can do that at the website, escapecollective.cc. And one of the first things you'll get is when you get that first sort of onboarding email, you'll get a link to join our Discord, our private members only Discord, bit of a kind of a clubhouse kind of thing. Not the clubhouse that's like the weird Twitter thing. I like a clubhouse, in a tree. That more of that kind of vibe.
Big clubhouse.
And yeah, it's like a clubhouse of the future.
Big tree.
Big tree, big clubhouse of the future. And one of the things that we do is we do live events. We do live podcasts. We've done some live kind of like race viewing / podcasts. Like Abby Mickey had Iris Lappendell on watching the end of Ghent-Wevelgem a couple weeks ago. We do stuff like that because it's this lovely little piece of technology that allows us to basically hang out with all of our members here. And we're gonna, at the end of today's show, we'll take questions, and that'll be sort of like the last 15, 20 minutes of today's podcast. So if you're not already a member, please go do so. Join all of the lovely folks in our live studio audience today. Head over to escapecollective.cc, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that,
On
Kaylee.
the show.
Just a couple of other little things on the Campagnolo patent stuff before we move on. Couple other things that Alan had uncovered is both derailleurs seem to have removable batteries a la SRAM Axis. But what's interesting for the Campagnolo stuff is the front derailleur, the battery mounts on the forward side, not the back. And the big thing for EPS fans, especially if you are a fan of running bigger tires, is this isn't explicitly called out in the patent, but it sure does appear to be it sure does appear that the rear tire clearance is going to be way better on this iteration of electronic Campagnolo than it has been in the past. And that's been a big limitation for this up until now, really, because EPS hasn't really changed. We don't really know anything about the brakes. Presumably they're still Magura based, which is fine. Campagnolo's hydraulic disc brakes have been, I would say, the best of the big three, I think, personally. No word about stuff like a rim brake option, like how many sprockets on the rear, anything like that. We don't really know. But anyway, point being, big news here is that it does look like it's confirmation that it's wireless, and we still have thumb buttons. So we'll see what happens. I'm pretty eager to find out more about this one.
Do we have any...
I can't wait.
Do we have any hint as to when this might happen? Because the rumors have been floating around since like 2020. Perhaps earlier. Do we think it's a this year thing, a next year thing?
I don't know. To be completely honest with you, even if it's really close to being done, like even it's to the point where it could be launched this year, I would almost prefer that Campagnolo sit on it for another year and just continue to iron out any bugs. Because one thing that I have to say about original Axis was that SRAM has a history of being pretty quick to market with stuff. And they were noticeably more careful with I guess first generation ETAP, I should say. There were prototypes floating around in pro ranks for a while. Like it was very clear that SRAM was testing the crap out of it. And I think they were better off because of it, because first generation ETAP, all things considered, like it really didn't have many issues at all. Like a lot of the big dramatic failures that people were anticipating just didn't happen. And I think it's because they took the time to really test it and really kind of work out bugs. And I hope Campagnolo does the same. So no, we have no indication on timing.
Whereas with Campy, I mean, we had 3 generations of EPS in pretty quick succession to each other. You know, like over the time that SRAM had their one. Well, SRAM didn't have a group set at that time, electronic. But Shimano, I mean, basically had 1 iteration. Campy had 3 in that time. So, yeah.
None of which worked particularly well.
I mean, they worked well. They'll just, when they didn't work, it was a nightmare to figure out why they didn't work. Yeah. When they were humming, then they were, very nice functioning group set. But, it was...
But anyway... Yeah, hopefully Campagnolo sits on this one a bit and just make sure it's really, really fully baked. Like I think Campagnolo is certainly not in a position where they can get away with having a big grand release of a new EPS electronic group set and have it not go well. So, so we'll see what happens there. But we have some other less fun Campagnolo news, although it's not entirely related to Campagnolo. We have a recall announcement coming from Open. They have recalled basically any bike that was ever purchased with Ekar. And the reason for that being, Open, they have a interesting internal cable, well, I guess partially internal cable routing system. They call it multi-port. A lot of people listening to this will be familiar with that, where all the lines enter into the frame on the top of the top tube right behind the stem. A little silly, in my opinion, anyway. But it's a little aluminum plug that goes in there. And Open says, quote, due to the construction of the Campagnolo hydraulic brake hose, it is more susceptible to damage than other brake hoses, unquote. And, quote again, the rear brake can fail, posing a crash hazard, unquote. I contacted Gerard Vrooman about this, and unfortunately haven't heard back from him by the time we recorded here. Campy has responded and says, our hoses are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. And as far as I can tell, the main culprit here is that Campagnolo uses Magura hoses, which are 5.5 millimeters in diameter instead of the 5 millimeter diameter that Shimano and SRAM uses. And it seems like Open maybe didn't account for that when they started speccing these bikes. So they're saying that you just have to replace the rear brake hose and have to use this different multi-port insert, which to me suggests that the hose is fine and the problem was with the port. So just heads up, anyone out there who has an Open with Ekar, you need to get that rear brake hose replaced and a new multi-port insert.
Quick question on this. With Open's design, is the hose basically being kinked at the entry point through that port? Is that sort of the issue here?
It's a little bit unclear for me. Open does say that if you turn the bar too far to, I think they say that if you turn it too far to the left, that you do run a risk of damaging the hose. But just based on how that multi-port setup is arranged, I mean, there is sort of like a fairly sharp right angle at the top of the insert. And then especially if it's sized for a 5 millimeter hose instead of a 5.5 mil hose, I mean, obviously it fits or else those bikes couldn't have been built. But if it's too sharp of an edge, then my guess is that it's prone to kinking. But in my experience, Magura and Campagnolo hoses are definitely not any more susceptible to damage than anything else. I think it's just a more matter of the port sizing. But anyway, just a heads up.
Okay. All right.
We talk about thermoplastic wheels. This is on the list here, and I'm very intrigued. And I also saw you post about this the other day, James.
Yeah. So. Traditionally, carbon fiber composite stuff out there, most of it's thermoset in the sense that you've got carbon fiber mixed in with this kind of like a 2-part epoxy, essentially. And then when it cures, it's done. Like it's just fully baked. You can't really do anything with it. You can't really turn it into anything else. But we have certainly been seeing this rise of thermoplastic composites, particularly in the mountain bike world. And these, instead of using a non-reversible resin, it uses sort of like a long chain polymer that you can essentially melt and cure and remelt. And a lot of these rims that I've been using, particularly for mountain bikes, they're made by a company called CSS Composites in Utah. And the reason why they've been more popular is because thermoplastics are generally more impact tolerant than thermoset stuff. And then you also get things like kind of like a more muted and damped ride, which actually is tangible from my experience. But anyway, this company, CSS Composites, that's been making rims for like Chris King and Roval and Night Composites, apparently, and Evil. They have launched their own in-house aftermarket brand called Forge and Bond, which is kind of a hint to how these rims are made. They're kind of elusive about it. But they're going out on their own aftermarket. They have a gravel and a mountain wheel set to start out with. What's interesting, I think, about this brand from a business perspective is they are an OEM manufacturer, like I said, for those other brands. And they're pretty coy about how their wheels are appreciably different from what they make for other companies. I mean, they're visually different. But as far as how they're different performance-wise, I'm not entirely sure.
My understanding with the other OE purchases of these rims from CSS, like for, say, Chris King, was that they were effectively allowed to use almost their own design requirements. Like I think it was Chris King that had announced that their rim was different to, say, what Roval bikes was selling. Like same technology, probably same manufacturing process, but like almost like a different layup, I guess is what you'd call it. And that they had done their own testing and that they had their own requirements. So I suspect there are subtle differences between many of these rims, and that Forge and Bond are probably perhaps, at the cutting edge of what they've learnt from others, producing rims for others, and perhaps turning that into a product for themselves. I think it's pretty interesting, but I think the most interesting thing with this is the manufacturing process. And for me, it's your thermoset, the way most other carbon rims are made, is very labor intensive because those carbon sheets of prepreg are typically hand laid and then go through molding and then often post processing, whereas this process can be a lot more automated. And while the pricing doesn't indicate this as such, but I think in future we'll probably see this technology really help to bring the price point of carbon down to a not quite a aluminium level, but somewhere in between what we expect between aluminium and carbon.
Yeah, I think once the initial capital investment costs are kind of more recouped, that sort of thing, then the per part piece can come down. Mm-hmm. But yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, the name of the brand Forge and Bond kind of alludes to how these things are made. Thermoset carbon fiber rims, the way those are made, as Dave mentioned, they're like all the pieces are pieces of prepreg are hand laid into a mold. You got like this 2-piece clamshell thing. It's all shut, and then it's heated, or it's cooked under heat and pressure. It comes out, like sometimes it's trimmed and finished and that sort of thing. This Forge and Bond rim, I don't know if this is exactly how they're doing it for other brands, but essentially what you have is, because, I mean, this is unique to the way that thermoplastics can be reformed and remelted. The plies they're cut by robot. They're laid into this mold by robot. But you have each rim essentially made as separate parts. You have each half of the sidewall. You have the tire bed. I'm trying to think if there may be another piece around the spoke, that a circumferential piece that goes around the spoke bed. That part I can't remember. But either way, you have at least 3 pieces, and they're essentially made flat in like this flat, like donut ring sort of thing. And that's the first step. And then once you have that part set up, then the individual pieces are placed into another mold, and they are remelted and reformed and reshaped to make a complete rim. And I guess one thing that Forge and Bond is saying is that because of the way these rims are constructed, there's apparently very, very minimal waste, like on the order of, like, I don't know, 10, 15 grams per rim, something like that in terms of total material. And what's neat is that whatever scrap is produced, and it also includes rims that come back to the factory for warranty repair, something that's broken, whatever, they can essentially just chop it all up and then remelt it and stick it into a mold and make something else out of it. They're not going to be making rims out of it again because the fibers are all chopped up at that point. But right now what they're doing is making these really cool little molded carbon fiber tire levers. And I mean, it's definitely downcycling. It's not like making another new thing out of the same out of the same old thing. But it's still pretty cool. I mean, they're making a big deal about the sustainability aspect of this thing, and they're making a big deal out of the fact that their scrap material is very valuable to them because they can use all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, again, like that's very different from thermoset, which starts as a giant reel, like imagine a giant reel of fabric, and that's put on a cutting table, and then they cut out the shapes that they need from that, and inevitably there's always overlap and excess, just like they make clothing, basically. There's always going to be scrap that they can't use, and that gets thrown away. So some brands claim that they're, say, 90% efficient with how they're using the pre-preg and thermoset carbon. So there's only 10% waste, but that's still 10% waste. So yeah, thermoset for me, thermoplastic for me is quite an intriguing path forward for the industry. But James, what are the downsides here? Are there downsides?
I mean, as compared to thermoset, thermoplastic does tend to be a little bit heavier typically. That is one big one. And then a lot of carbon fiber experts will say that thermoplastic stuff is just not as stiff. It's just not as structurally ideal as thermoset, as far as like making like the absolute lightest and stiffest stuff out there. But for rims, I'm not sure if that's something that you really necessarily need or want all the time anyway. I would say that a lot of times you don't necessarily want a stiffer rim. A lot of the stiffness comes from how it's built anyway. But in terms of ride quality, there's a lot to be said for a rim that's a little bit softer. As I said before, test rides of this wheel set and other thermoplastic stuff I've ridden, it does seem to have like a more damped and muted feel. It's not necessarily softer. It's almost sort of like just quieter, which is a little bit weird. But aside from that, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I'm definitely not a composites expert, but I don't see, aside from the weight thing, I don't know of a lot of downsides to thermoplastics versus thermoset.
Have you heard of or seen any durability concerns?
Not yet.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure they'll come up, but as of right now, like nothing real big has popped up. So I do have a set of these wheels in for review right now. I know the embargo lifted on this yesterday, and but I just don't have enough time on these wheels yet to really do a proper review. And since we're trying to avoid just kind of doing kind of boring press release flips over here, we're going to wait just a little bit longer until I have a little bit more time on these, but that should come probably before the end of the month, I'm guessing.
On the subject of wheels, I want to move us on because I want to make sure we can get to questions at the end here. So next on the list here, some interesting new Rovals.
Yeah. They're definitely new. Roval's got two new wheel sets. So there's the Alpinist SLX disc, which is the Alpinist is their low profile road wheel, which is designed for really weight savings. Ridden to a world championship win last year. And they've got the SLX is actually an aluminium version, which is new. So I guess on paper, these actually sound kind of cool. There's claim weight of 1,485 grams for the pair, although Roval do specify that that's a sample weight. So you could probably imagine the production weight might go up a little bit. 24 millimeter rim depth, 20 millimeter internal rim width with hooks. And at the center of it is a DT Swiss 350 hub, which I like, and a US $800 retail price. For me, this does feel. Sorry, what's that?
For both of them.
Yeah, you get a front and a rear for that price. For me, this feels like an OE play. It's the sort of wheel that you'd expect to find on there probably Ultegra-ish or lower, maybe a 105 Di2 kind of bike. But it seems like a pretty good wheel, and a big fan of that hub at the center of this.
I would push back on the OE play thing, because this does kind of move into the territory of companies like Boyd and Hunt and stuff like that, because a lot of those companies do have less expensive, kind of higher end aluminum wheels. And we haven't seen a whole lot of that from the bigger brands. And for Roval to come out with a kind of more premium, presumably aftermarket aluminum wheel is an interesting development. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. So no,
I wonder how much aftermarket market there is for a wheel like that, really, though. Right?
Hunt would probably have the data on that, but yeah, I don't know.
We could ask. That's just purely anecdotal, but
yeah,
carbon wheels are cheap enough now and come with the cachet, rightly or wrongly, and I still feel like that's the direction most folks will probably end up going.
and aerodynamic benefit
even at the
carbon.
sort of $800,000.
Yeah, 800. Yeah, I think I think the main thing is you're probably not going to get much aerodynamic gain, if any, with these wheels. So I think that's where carbon will still hold favor. But the other wheel from Roval, they've released a new Terra CLX 2 wheel set, which is their top of the line gravel wheel set. That now drops 50 grams to a claim weight of 1,250 grams. And basically all they've done there is they've used the hubs from the Alpinist CLX wheels, so their lightest carbon wheel, which is a Roval hub. It's a lighter hub. It's still running DT Swiss 180 internals, but that drops the 50 grams. The rims, spokes, everything else remain the same. But yeah, nice little subtle update there.
Yeah, and that hub is, if you look at it, it's essentially just a lot more aggressively machined. There's just a lot less hub in those hubs. Yep.
So 50 grams less, everything else the same. It's a good wheel set.
I'm pretty excited about that one, because I will say that the Terra CLX, the first generation version, was one of my favorite gravel wheel sets that I've used. Mainly because they're just so tangibly light. 1,300 grams for the first gen one, 1,250 for these. They held up to everything that I'd been able to throw at them. I mean, it's not like I was smashing them into rocks when the tires were flat or something. But they were really light. They felt really good. Rode well. Seemed like they were plenty strong. Pretty eager to see how those are. And 1,250 for a set of wheels that can handle that sort of stuff and offer that kind of internal width is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of those wheels. I used the Terra CL version, which is the cheaper version, same rim as the CLX, but with the 350 hub, and big fan of those wheels because you get a 25mm internal rim width with hooks. What a novelty! And it's just a very nice, versatile wheel. That so I've tested them extensively, haven't had any issues, so it's high on my list as far as gravel wheels go.
Looks pretty good. Dave, we got some new computers that just hit the market too, don't we?
We do. Garmin's been busy. They have released the new Edge 540 and Edge 840 computers, which now are very, very similar to each other, but with the main difference being that the 840 adds touchscreen ability, or doesn't add, but the 840 offers touchscreen ability, while the 540 just sticks to the 7 buttons that can keep your fingers very busy. The 840 also keeps those same buttons. So that's really the only difference. There's about $100 difference between those two computers. As far as other new things, you've got USB-C charging now. There's multi-band GNSS, so probably more stable and faster pickup from satellites. Probably the fun one that I like is that the mounting wings are now replaceable, which I think is a nice feature for anyone that has worn out those mounting wings on a previous computer. And the feature that everyone else is talking about is that they now come with the option of solar charging, so you can increase the battery runtime to as much as 60 hours if you just stand in the sunniest part you can find.
Yeah, and they also have what is it called, like a Climb Pro feature, I think, is it Climb Pro Free or Free Climb Pro? Anyway, basically where it sort of just predicts how long the climb is going to be that you just hit.
It's quite Karoo 2 kind of feeling. That
very Karoo 2.
Mm.
So, I mean, obviously, it's not going to be completely accurate all the time. It's not going to read your mind, especially if you are kind of on more windy roads or on a climb that has some options. But still kind of neat to be able to see exactly how much climb is ahead of you. I know I like having that kind of info.
Yeah, I've been using a Karoo 2 lately, and I need to spend the time to adjust the settings because that climb feature keeps taking the place of my power figures, which is not what you want when you hit every climb. But that's a me problem.
I'm not sure I want to see my power figures on a climb. I think I'd rather just know when it's over. But we're not going to talk a ton about this one because we don't actually have one on hand yet. But we are working on getting probably an 840 into Ronin's hands. So stay tuned on that one. We'll have some more for you on that soon enough.
My quick question on this one is the 540 and 840. The only thing that really separates them is the touchscreen and $100 difference. My question is why? This is a tough one because I know James is just going to shut me down. But my feeling is why not benefit from the economies of scale and just have the one model with the touchscreen and let the manufacturing powers allow you to hopefully bring that price point down. Thoughts?
I am 100% positive that Garmin has done this math and knows that they will make more money by splitting that offering into two different ones, into a more premium and a slightly more affordable version than they would if they just offered the one. I am 100% positive that they have done that math. And for me, well,
I was say I hate touchscreens.
Yeah, I mean,
so,
I used the 830 and the 530 pretty extensively, and there were definitely times when I preferred the 530, just because I don't always like using a touchscreen. But I eventually ended up using the 830 more, mainly because I just ended up locking the touchscreen a lot. I got into that habit a lot more. It's just so, like, drop of sweat didn't screw up the functionality or whatever. But it's basically just a matter of preference. And, I would also say that you can make the argument that, yes, it's only $100 difference. But at the same time, if I said to you, hey, Dave, Venmo me $100 right now, you'd probably not really want to do that.
Depends. What do you want it for?
Yeah, doesn't matter. It's only $100. Send it over. But anyway, yeah. So I am sure that Garmin's done that math. So I think if only, like Kaylee said, Kaylee doesn't like touchscreens. Other people don't like buttons, and I think it's important probably for Garmin to offer that difference. I'm sure they're going to sell more of them as a result anyway, though.
It's worth adding that there's actually 4 models on offer here because each of the 540 and the 840 are also available without the solar functionality, which saves about $100 as well. I mean, it's, in my mind, I don't know, maybe like a 540 without the solar feature, and then the 840 does have the solar feature. Then you have 4 into 2 models. But hey, I'm not a Garmin product manager, so I'll be quiet now.
All right, well, let's move on because we want to get through this stuff so we can hit some audience questions here. Next thing I kind of wanted to talk about quickly, Trek has a couple of new road helmets, and I'm sure people have seen them on the heads of team riders, Trek Segafredo in particular. You've got the kind of lighter weight Velocis model, which is their, again, like lighter weight, kind of more all-rounder. And then you have the Ballista Aero model. So the Velocis is claimed weight is 260 grams for a medium CPSC model. The big thing is that the ventilation is a lot better. The Ballista, the Aero model is a little bit heavier, 275, still not that heavy. But the big thing is that it's supposedly 10.1 watts faster than a Velocis at TT speeds, which is interesting. Is that helmet's got a very distinctly long and tapered tail with a pretty novel flow-through design. But I think the 2 biggest things on these helmets, in my perception, is that you got MIPS Air, no wave cell.
What about the biggest innovation in 30 years, James? What happened to it?
Apparently it wasn't big enough.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, apparently it wasn't big enough. But MIPS Air in both of those, no wave cell. And both of them get 5-star ratings from Virginia Tech, which is nice to see. But the other thing that's interesting is that these are branded as Trek helmets, not Bontrager. This is something that we picked up on when Trek released a whole bunch of new clothing last year, or maybe 2 years ago. Trek seems to be moving away from the Bontrager brand for soft goods. It looks like it's still keeping it for components and wheels and that sort of thing. But for soft goods and helmets, I would presume shoes are probably coming next. They are moving over to the Trek brand.
That's very interesting to me. I remember probably mid-2000s was when they roughly phased out the Trek brand for all their helmets and for all their soft good line. I recall being in a Trek store and seeing that stuff, and at that point it probably late 2000s became under the Bontrager brand. So yeah, it does interest me that they're moving away from that, but I guess it's not too different to what their competitors are doing in the way of, say, Specialized and Giant and a few other names that have their house brands. So yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because there are clearly two schools of thought here, because you on the one hand have like Specialized and Roval, and like Roval, like Specialized gets annoyed if you even just like mention Roval and Specialized in the same breath. Like if you even dare to suggest that Roval is part of Specialized, they get annoyed because they have this big thing like there's separate companies and separate staff and engineering and so on and so forth, blah blah blah. Like, let's get real. It's a Specialized wheel.
Boxes say Specialized on them.
Yeah. It's like is Roval's headquarters in Morgan? Yeah. Is the headquarters in Morgan Hill? Yes, it is. But then
silly.
Yeah, and like Trek had, I guess certainly they felt that there wasn't enough cachet with the Trek brand name at some point, which is why they started moving everything over to Bontrager. And even before that is why they had that Icon brand for their like component range, like back in the 90s. But yeah, what's interesting now is that they clearly feel like there is enough or like more brand recognition with Trek than Bontrager, and they feel that Trek is just a stronger brand name, particularly in that category, and they're moving back to it. So interesting.
I wonder if part of it was actually the strategy of like that if you didn't want a Trek bicycle, that you could still ride Bontrager shoes or a Bontrager helmet and not feel like you're mixing brands in a dirty way. Whereas like, you ride a Trek and you wear Specialized shoes, it kind of, you don't look very pro. Not that there's not that fine. That bothers me, but I know it does bother consumers.
But I don't know. I feel like that's one area that Specialized has actually been successful in, that they've got their shoes all over the Pro Peloton, for example.
Everywhere.
I know lots of people who run Specialized shoes that aren't riding a Specialized bike.
Yeah, because they're amazing.
The sort of irony is like that's why these brands get all angry about us referring to Roval as a piece of Specialized or Bontrager as a piece of Trek, as they want that additional market, right? But like, I mean, the shoes prove that it's possible. If it's a really good product, which Specialized shoes are, it's a fantastic product, then people will ignore brand name to some extent. So
yeah, I don't know.
I mean, this feels like a good move to me. Like, I think Bontrager probably just confuses a lot of consumers, honestly. Like it just totally different brand name that a lot of new cyclists probably never heard of before. I had a friend who thought it was pronounced like in the French way for a long time, Bontrager. And I spent like a year trying to figure out what on earth he was talking about. He was talking about his Bontrager shoes.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of confusion that can come from kind of needlessly splitting these things off, I think.
I do think that the Bontrager differentiation and Roval as well is Bontrager has kind of worked to their favor, because I remember working in a shop which was a Pinarello dealer, and they used to spec a lot of their Dogma builds with Bontrager wheels, and like it's just because it was a fantastic wheel choice, and I think Roval fits in that same space. So I wonder if Trek will, on this path that they're on, keep Bontrager as a component brand. I can't unhear it now. I can't undo it. We'll keep it as a component brand, and then Trek takes over for soft goods, or whether we see this brand starting with a B come to an end. I don't know. We'll see.
We should ask Keith what he thinks of his name just floating around in the ether like this.
It's funny that you mentioned Keith, because Kelly, I mentioned this to you the other day, is I actually reached out to Keith Bontrager on Twitter the other day, because I actually wanted to see if he wanted to be on for a podcast guest to kind of just talk about bike tech in general, but also talk about baking, because that seems to be a growing hobby of his. And he said actually he's sort of stepped back from the bicycle world as of 2015. Essentially when his partner was struck by a bus driver in somewhere in the UK, and she ended up as an amputee. So he has been primarily dedicated to getting her back on a bike and getting her life back in order and stuff. So he's been busy. So anyway, point being, I don't know if I don't know how much he would really care what's happening to his name right now.
Yeah, I've gotten that sense over the last couple of years that his attention is elsewhere. Anyway, we can move on from Trek and Bontrager. Any other news items that you guys want to hit before we get into what is on our minds and over the heads of our families? Or
there was one left from James.
Yeah, there was one left. I mean, we can hit this one really quick. That clothing brand Q36.5, they have a new range of clothing called Gridskin, spelled GRDXKN, of course, all capital letters because vowels are evil apparently. But they use this kind of intriguing, they call it highly abrasion resistant cushioning layer of padding at key areas, which is apparently just sort of like this raised textured printed padding material that's on the inside of the shoulders and hips and stuff. It's yet another attempt by a road clothing brand to provide some crash protection. This one looks intriguing. It's quite light and only adds about 20 grams supposedly. It actually looks neat. I am curious if it might even add some sort of aero benefit because of that texture, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of attention on in clothing. But I'm actually kind of intrigued with it, almost from like a mountain bike perspective. Like if you were to wear these bibs under baggies, and then if you were to wipe out on your hip and something like that, like would that help at all? I don't really know how. I haven't seen it yet. I don't have a sample in my hands yet. I don't know how dense it is or how tough it is or anything. Q36.5 is certainly making a big deal out of this, but it's something that came across my desk not too long ago that I thought was worth mentioning, and then we'll have samples soon. I think Ronan's going to have a set pretty soon too, so maybe he and I will compare notes and hopefully not compare notes of how they were sliding across the pavement.
He didn't crash in the kermesse that we put him in last week. I was very proud of him.
That was despite a slow puncture,
running like. Yeah, he had this puncture for like 3 days, and we inflated it right before the race. And I think he started the race with about 35 psi in a 32 mil tire. But it was wet in Belgium, so it was fine.
I would rather not let Ronan test this stuff because I'm pretty sure when he broke his leg, he was wearing Assos's crash protection clothing.
True. Although he broke his leg by just like putting his foot on the ground.
No, like falling over, like basically falling over in a cross race, and his foot was still attached.
Tipping over. Ugh.
Mm-hmm.
No good.
Anyway.
Sorry, Ronan.
All right. What is on your mind and over the head of your family? Let's start with Dave Rome.
Work stands.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Mainly that I don't understand why people are so passionate about race stands these days. So race stands being the type of stand that capture the fork dropout and then you support the rest of the bike by the bottom bracket shell. I just think they're so redundant these days. Like for the last 2 decades, you go to a mountain bike race, you go to a cyclocross race, you never see this kind of stand. It's only with the road teams. But now disc brakes, you can't adjust a front disc brake while the bike is in the stand. So you end up doing it like with more than the hands you have, and you end up hating life because your stand is stupid. Or you have a new modern bike with like an asymmetric bottom bracket shell, which doesn't even fit the stand. So I don't know. I'm all about stands that clamp the bike safely. But I just don't understand why people are still buying race style stands. James, thoughts?
I have on very good authority why teams still use race stands.
I know, so you don't crack your frame, but
yeah. So
I have one over here, and it's just annoying.
Well, yeah. So
I hate it.
So this very good authority that I'm referencing here has told me that essentially the reason why teams have used these things forever and ever and ever is that particularly once carbon frames became a lot more popular. And much more widespread. The brands essentially told the teams that they will not cover these frames if they are clamped in a frame. or clamped in a stand, and that includes even clamped in a seat post stand. And so therefore teams have been using these race style work stands forever and ever and ever. I guess in fairness, when the bulk of their time is spent, well, at least when they're at a race anyway, when the bulk of their time is just spent washing a bike, it is easier to wash a bike in a race style stand because you can just sort of like spin it around.
Okay. Yeah.
But as far as actually working on the bike, yeah, race stands are kind of dumb. I'm with you there.
Yeah, and I think the clamping of the bike, I think even at a World Tour level, many mechanics would have been quite old school, perhaps working from the days of steel frames where you could clamp the top tube just fine, and perhaps they carried that over and were clamping the top tube of carbon frames, which is an absolute no-no. So like on any modern bike, you really do need to clamp by the seat post, but that shouldn't be an issue if you're doing it sensibly. And then you've got adapter stands like the Silka Hero Bell, which kind of support the frame in a safe way if the seat post doesn't offer a shape that's safe to clamp. So I don't know. For me, I just keep returning to the fact that I don't understand the use of race stands. I think in a World Tour sense where every bike from the team is the same, so you have the same through axle over and over, and you have basically the same kind of bottom bracket, so you can set up your race stand to fit 20 of the same bike. I think that makes sense. But for anyone using these at home that might have more than, say, 2 or 3 bikes, where you need to adjust the stand to fit each one, or a pro shop that is dealing with all styles of bikes, I don't understand why people are still buying these things. But hey, each their own.
We have an audience question on this subject. Do we want to briefly jump into a Q&A and then pop back out?
No, let's save it.
Sure. We could do that.
Should we? No.
Let's see if we can get... Robert just typed his question in here, so we can just read it. That's easier. Robert Barrows, I'm taking an extended trip by boat. I am bringing one of my bikes as well as a few spare parts and tools. Wanted to ask if any of you have any experience with that alt angle, am I saying that right, stand that appears to be 2 clamps and a stick.
Which Dave, of course, has on hand right now.
Oh, God, of course. What you can't see, podcast listeners, is that Dave just literally pulled that out from the little top hat where his bunny lives and somehow just had it waiting. We didn't plant that question. I swear we didn't plant that question. All right, Dave, so your opinion on this for Robert.
So Altangle, they have 2 products. There's the hanger, and then I think it's the Connect. So the hanger is the one that goes through a door frame. So you actually use the door frame as your I don't know, you know, the central support of your stand, and then from that comes out a clamp that you can clamp the bike via the seat post. The Connect is actually off the hanger, and it's literally just a clamp with a pole and then another clamp, and it lets you clamp your sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, but it lets you clamp a pole onto any kind of upright object. So if you've got like a handrail or something like that, you can clamp a work stand onto it, and
or like a ladder or a pole or a sign or whatever.
Yeah, as long as it's kind of a small enough diameter to clamp onto, it'll work. So yeah, it's tough to say for a boat trip which one. If you have a door frame in a boat, depends on the size
Big
of the
boat.
Yeah, the hanger is actually
sailboat,
quite
got a mast.
Yeah, the door frame one is actually quite good. It's quite stable, but you end up blocking the door frame as a result of it. So it actually does sit quite low down on the door frame, and you do have to duck quite a bit. It's a real game of limbo. Don't leave it up permanently because someone will walk into it. And yeah, it is very...
Ask Dave how he knows.
Yeah, ask me how I know. It is actually very stable. It's very strong. It's as strong as the door frame, basically. It's a pretty good product, actually. I was pretty impressed with that. The Connect is something I'm about to review. It's much more simple, and it works as well as your ability to clamp it onto a strong enough upright. So if you've got a upright pole that actually has the right diameter and is actually strong enough to lever a bike off of, then it is actually a very good option. And on a boat, then yeah, I think you'd probably find that sort of upright structure fairly readily. So I'd say go for it.
Oh, Robert has just followed up and said it's a 400 plus foot ship.
Wow.
That's a big boat.
Okay. But the door frames won't work.
Wow.
Yeah, so yeah, it just goes back that connect, the one that you need to attach to a pole. The pole needs to be a small enough diameter. Like, for example, the upright on a Park Tool shop stand, which is, trying to remember the name, the PRS3, I think it is. That is quite a large diameter shape. I'm struggling to think of the shape. Probably 3-inch diameter is off the top of my head.
That's like it's like 60 mil, something like that.
Yeah,
it's not that big.
Okay, that's for me. I found that borderline too big of a diameter for the hanger for the Connect product. It sort of almost slips off that, and you really need to clamp it on really tight. So it needs to be quite a thin structure that you're clamping onto. But yeah, James, have you used one of these?
I have a little bit. They actually sent me a pretty early one. They have made some revisions since the one that they sent me, and it is, yeah, like you said, Dave. It is basically 2 clamps connected by a pole. And the one I have, you can't rotate the orientation of the clamps relative to each other, whereas the new ones, you can at least rotate them like 90 degrees, so it's a little bit more versatile. They also machined out the clamps on the newer one, so it's not quite as like ridiculously heavy as the one that I have. It is useful if you have the right setup. So yeah, if you have some sort of like upright thing that you can clamp this thing to, that it's super handy. But if you don't, then not so much. But anyway, yeah, Robert, if you've got something like that, that thing is very nice and small and tidy and compact, and it does work pretty reasonably well. Another workstand question that we have, if we're just going to stick to this just for a bit before I get on to what I have on my mind. Question from David Watson. This is a good one. He said he's asking, how do you recommend putting a full suspension carbon mountain bike with a dropper post in a workstand? He said he can't really clamp to the post or the carbon tubes, and there's no space in the triangle for a Hero Bell frame clamp. Dave, what are your thoughts on this? Because I definitely have a thought on this one.
I clamp to the exposed part of the dropper, which is
that's
probably
what I do too.
Not ideal, but what I do, I make sure that the clamp is perfectly clean. So I'll use like isopropyl alcohol and clean the clamp to make sure there's no grit on the clamp jaws, and then I'll just go ahead and clamp the dropper as close to the base of it. So therefore you're reducing the amount of leverage on it. But yeah, I mean, if the dropper post, it's designed to hold your body weight, so the reverse of holding the bike weight isn't such a big issue.
Yeah, I mean that's what I do as well, and I don't worry about it from a structural standpoint. But I do find that it's not always the most secure place to grab it, just because that exposed stanchion is typically pretty slippery.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've mentioned this to feedback before. But if I haven't, hopefully someone there is listening, because what I would love to see is a set of dedicated jaws that are essentially profiled to kind of straddle that the seal collar on a dropper seat post. And granted, you do have different diameters of dropper seat posts, but most of them will be 30.9 or 31.6. And then the stanchion diameter is pretty consistent across most brands. So I would love to see a jaw that is profiled to essentially have that seal head in the middle, and then clamp the kind of the upper part of the stationary part of the post, and then the lower part of the stanchion all together, because that would strike me as a much more secure way of clamping a mountain bike in a workstand.
You just need a 3D printer.
Warning about that clamp spot. I have worked the collars loose on droppers before doing that.
By clamping.
Well, no,
if you stick it in and then twist to the left.
But that's why you would have this profiled jaw, because you wouldn't actually clamp on the collar.
Mm-hmm.
There'd be essentially a cutout on that collar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just mean like if I clamp, bike sitting behind me, the Epic, I've done that before where without what you're talking about, if you try to clamp it on the lower part of the dropper post, I have accidentally not like fully unscrewed those collars, but loosened them basically, because you got quite a bit of leverage on it. So I tend to just clamp on the.
Yep.
the upper.
Yeah, and Mark H has just commented that sounds like a good use of a 3D printer, and I agree. I have actually seen 3D printed solutions basically in line with what James is suggesting. You can. I know people have done this specific to their bike, and not a hard thing to print. So anyway, another reason for you, James, to get a 3D printer.
Oh, don't even get me started, Dave.
Let's move on to what's on James's mind. This is going to be a long episode, and I'm okay with that. What's on your mind, James? So then we'll get to the Q&A.
I guess anyone who's visited the site today will know that I've been thinking a lot about headset-based cable routing for mountain bikes. And what's on my mind is that I think it's royally stupid. Like, it's one of the stupidest tech developments I have seen in the bike industry in recent years. Because even I can accept that there are arguments for fully internal or fully concealed routing on a road or gravel bike. I mean, yeah, it looks sweet, fine. A lot of those bikes are not going to see super adverse weather. I mean, a lot of the people who own bikes like that are, kind of tend to baby them a little bit. They're kind of more aero. You can make all those arguments, whatever. You can't make any of those arguments for a mountain bike. So for running those cables through an upper headset bearing, just to like kind of tidy up the front end a little bit, is just stupid. Like, it's just dumb. Because you still have lines hanging out in, between the brake lever and wherever the lines enter the headset. And it just doesn't help that much, even if you trim those lines super tight. I mean, it's clear we're clearly in an interim situation right now, because without question, the industry is trying to move to a point where they can conceal the lines on a mountain bike completely. And I hate it.
Counterpoint. Looks cool.
It does look cool. I actually have a hard tell with this. And to be fair, I chose this path knowing that I would be using wireless SRAM on it. It looks cool. But James, the other counterpoint, and this is going to only anger you more, and as it should, it's just an interim. The exposed cable that you're seeing at the moment before it gets to the head tube, it's just temporary, because the industry will eventually route that brake hose through the handlebar and stem for you. So, yay.
Mm-hmm.
Our favorite old grumpy hater, Zach Edwards. This exact topic. So actually, James's story was sort of floating around my friend like text chat this morning, which Zach is on, and one of my friends was very much in favor of this trend because he thinks it looks cool, and he's like, well, if people want to buy expensive bikes that look cool, that seems fine. The other side of it was the sort of Zach was pointing out that the real danger here is this stuff starts to trickle down, because like people buying $2,000 mountain bikes want their bikes to look cool too, so you could see it sort of trickling down eventually. But the problem with that is Zach brought up an example of some maintenance that he was doing. Somebody needed a new headset bearing, and instead of being a 15-minute job that would cost $30, it was going to be like a $300 service fee, right? New hydraulic lines, new everything, even more if you were running mechanical shifting. So you look at a bike that's $1,500 or $2,000 with this technology 5 years from now, and to replace a headset bearing, they have to spend $300 to do that, which is a sizable portion of the entire cost of the bicycle. And that's, I think, where we end up running into just real issues.
100%.
It kind of goes back to, we've had similar conversations like this before. At the high end, if you buy a $10,000 bike or $15,000 bike, I don't really care if you have to spend $300 to replace your headset bearings. And you probably kind of deserve that.
But also that
if you're buying a $1,500 bike, that's bad news for. It's just bad news for getting any new people into the sport.
Well, also that $15,000 bike has more than likely wireless shifting, so you really only have, say, one or two brake hoses to contend with if you need to replace the headset. There's not a lot of downside to it, and that person can afford the higher service bill. But yeah, to your point, Kaylee, at the lower end, that bike absolutely does not have wireless shifting. It probably has mechanical shifting, which requires maintenance, which requires new cables, which requires a smooth cable path, which the internal routing doesn't provide. And that person also can't afford the massive service bill because they most likely that's why they're on a lower end bike. So yeah, I completely agree that there's a place for this internal cable routing, and I think it's at the high end, and I really don't like the trickle down that the industry will inevitably do.
There's no place for it. It should be killed with fire.
Well, I mean, like to kind of back up what James is saying, the problem with this is that you put it at the high end, and then everyone else wants it anyway, right? And so like then you're just sort of, okay, we're just acquiescing to consumer demand to trickle this stuff down. I think you could make exactly the same argument about electronic shifting, which is like, none of us need it. It makes bikes more expensive. It doesn't really make riding any better, but because the top end bikes have it, it starts to trickle its way down, and now 105 Di2 bikes are $8,000, right? Which makes me just want to freak out.
Here's my thing. So, a couple of things I want to make, a couple of points I want to make here. So, one, the Scott that I actually pictured in that article, it belongs to a buddy of mine, and he paid $9,000 for that thing, and he definitely has the money to have it worked on, but he hates that bike. Like, he bought it, paid full retail for it, absolutely hates it because of this feature. Because it'd be one thing if this were done well. It'd be one thing if somebody were like, I want to completely hide all the lines, and like, we're going to do a really sweet job of it and really think it through. It's another thing entirely to want to put this feature on a bike and do a completely half-assed job on it, which, I'm sorry, Scott, like, we know a lot of people there. A lot of your bikes generally are very, very good. That is not one of them, because having taken that front end apart to really take a look at how this thing is done, it's a complete disaster. There's all these little plastic bits everywhere. Nothing is held together very well. Nothing's sealed at all. My buddy washes his bike, and the bike just fills with water. His upper headset bearing is completely rusted out and roached, and he's only had it for a few months. And keep in mind, we live in Colorado here, and it's bone dry. So, like, there is absolutely no. They don't even use a stainless bearing. Like, it's just purely for aesthetics, and it is absolute garbage. It should not exist, especially not on a bike that costs that much. So I would argue that even though someone maybe does have the money, who has spent that kind of money on an expensive bike, they shouldn't have to. They should expect that a bike that costs that much is well done, well engineered, well thought through. And if it's not going to be well engineered, well thought through, and well done, it shouldn't exist. So if you want it, like, this whole interim thing, the whole interim thing just needs to go away. Like, do it well or don't do it at all.
We just need wireless brakes. Solves all of it.
And
Oh,
I'm sure the interim version of wireless brakes will be great.
Before we move on, can
Dave?
I make one vague promise, which is in our bike reviews moving forward, we will bang this drum a lot. And I think we'll also, especially at the entry level, aim to cover expected service costs associated with these kind of features, so that there's no. We're going to be as transparent as we can about the long-term costs of some of these aesthetic features, and in turn, hopefully, turn people away from them when they don't make sense to own.
So, with that said, rant over.
Yeah.
But it looks cool. So, should we move on to a little Q&A here?
Yes,
Get some
please.
folks. All right, let me turn on the little recorder. We'll do a couple audio questions here, and then there's a couple questions that have shown up in the text chat while we were chatting. So we'll get to those as well. All right, I've just invited Robert. Hello, Robert.
Hi, thank you for the information about that All-Tangle stand. That's good, and I can't wait for the information or the review to pop up on the website.
Thanks, Robert.
So, I have more tools question, actually. And before you just say yes to the intro is, do I need? I am wondering if the PC Link tool to connect Di2 to my computer would be a helpful thing to get. I have currently 2 Di2 bikes in the garage, and probably will be adding more as the time comes. No e-bikes yet, though.
Let me just double check the product name on this. Off the top of my head, it's the PCE02, is it? Which one are we talking about? Yeah. PCE02. Okay, that's scary that I actually got it right off the top of my head. So yeah, Shimano PCE02. It's a shop tool. It's in Australia. They're like $300. In the US, I think they're roughly $200. Basically, it's the only thing it offers over the top of the regular Di2 charger that allows you to actually connect to a computer as well is detailed diagnostics. So the PCE02 allows you to basically connect through the eTube wire, where you can connect it directly to each individual component to figure out where, say, a battery drain issue is happening or where a fault has occurred. For me, that's kind of the limit of the usability of it, and I question whether you'll actually get any use out of it. I've got one. I use it very, very occasionally, but truthfully, I could probably do without it as well. So yeah, I think probably not something a home mechanic needs. I think it's going to be very, very rare that you actually need the functionality it provides. James, any thoughts?
I can usually evaluate my cable actuated stuff pretty quickly without a computer.
No, so grumpy today, James.
But in all seriousness, I mean, Di2 stuff generally is pretty reliable. And if you have an issue where you might even think you might even need something like this, I think oftentimes those sorts of issues are so few and far between that you would almost be better off economically just bringing it to a qualified mechanic and have them diagnose it for you.
Yeah, the other thing that a shop has that I personally don't have, and I assume, Robert, you don't have, is that they have spare parts to interchange and figure out where the issue is. So, they'd have spare wires to swap in to figure out if it's a wire issue or a new derailleur, whether that fixes the issue straight away. And that's something that the PCO2 kind of gets you towards. It's like, oh, this part doesn't work. And then you're like, okay, great. Now I need to try a part that does work. And that's if you just hand it to a shop, they'll be able to do that for you in the very rare occasion that needs to be done. And it is very, very rare. I've probably, again, needed it once or twice in the last 6 or 7 years that this thing, the Di2 has been prolific for.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Robert. Let's try to get Alex in again. Let's see if this works.
Hello.
Hey, it works.
There we are. Success.
Sorry, my normal push to talk key had migrated one key over to the right, and I do not know why.
Very odd. What's your question?
My question is inspired by a recent experience I had while testing out a new tubeless setup, which is I had installed the tire on a rim before building up the wheel, and I foolishly used Gorilla Tape on it. And it turns out that this has a special affinity for the type of rubber on the bead. And so basically they fused together, and I had to ultimately cut the tire off. So I'm down a brand new tubeless tire. So I figured I would ask if you guys know of any untoward reactions that different household items or different bike specific items have with each other that could cause something like this or a similar reaction elsewhere on the bike.
I haven't heard of any like chemical reactions between like of that sort of thing, or of that sort. I will say that the vast majority of mechanics that I know or have spoken to would strongly recommend against using Gorilla Tape for tubeless tape for a few reasons. One, it's quite thick. It's quite a bit thicker than regular tubeless tape, so your tire will tend to fit a lot tighter than it really is designed to. The other thing is because the adhesive that's used on Gorilla Tape is pretty thick and kind of like gooey and squirmy. It actually doesn't stay in place very well. It tends to migrate and kind of wander on the rim. And it also is not completely like sealant proof. So you do tend to get a little bit of sealant and then some seepage of fluid into the rim cavity. And then that fluid seepage into the rim cavity is problematic because particularly if you're using aluminum nipples, it'll just corrode the nipples, and then you'll have to rebuild your whole wheel because all your nipples are going to start to crack. But the other thing is it does cause issues with tubeless tire fitment. So I would definitely switch to a conventional tubeless tape. I guess as you have done that already. Just
to be clear, the Gorilla Tape was a very temporary installation. I was actually inflating the tire using a tube to check chainstay clearance because this is an extremely wide setup. I'm using 47 millimeter tires on a 35 millimeter internal rim.
Wow.
Yeah, it's wide, but I got a very good deal on the rims. And actually, thanks to Ian's article on the Ritchie Outback, where he had I think the exact same setup. He said it was a little off, but okay to live with. So hopefully that's the same for me. But yeah, I only had the tire set up with a tube on there for a couple days, also partly to stretch out the tire for installation. And yeah, the Gorilla Tape, as you mentioned, it did squirm, and the adhesive did sort of bond with the tire bead, and it was absolutely impossible to take off.
That's
So
wild.
like I cut off one of the beads and I tried to pull off the other one, and with my full body weight, I could not separate it from the bead.
I actually wonder if it wasn't so much a adhesive reaction as it was just that the tire ended up fitting so tightly on the rim that you just couldn't get it off.
You just couldn't get it off. Judging by the amount of Gorilla Tape that came off with the bead when I ultimately did end up cutting it off, I would wager to say that there was some kind of reaction, be it chemical or physical. But regardless, a lot of the Gorilla Tape came up with the bead.
The mechanical fit between a lot of modern tubeless tires and some tubeless rims is pretty insane. Like I mentioned earlier, that a lot of World Tour mechanics now are in the habit of just cutting tubeless tires off the rim because it's easier. For me, I've had to resort. I've actually got like some 3D printed jaws that fit into my bench vise that allow me to unseat certain tires. You can also, I know James, you're partial, and I still use it. Like the jaws of a work stand are pretty good for basically squeezing the bead together, and then use the wheel as the leverage to push off these beads. But yeah, it gets to a point. Certain combinations get to a point where it's impossible to do it by hand. You need sort of additional tooling to clamp onto that tire, and inevitably you'll probably end up stretching the bead of the tire in the process.
Team tube inside.
Yeah, it's not great.
Don't want to deal with it. Interesting question. Thanks, Alex. I've never heard of that particular thing happening before, but
Gorilla Tape for tubeless,
Gorilla
not good.
Tape. That's our 2 cents, I suppose. Let's take. Do we have another? We have some written questions here.
There was a question if a tool like a bead jacker would work to remove the tire from the seat, and not in my experience. You need something to, there's nothing that really gets into the gap between the rim and the tire bead, so you actually just need a full mechanical force to break it free.
Okay, well,
here we go. So I was gonna say Jimmy put the question in the chat here, so I'll just read it out. So this is less of a tech question, more of kind of a tech question. So Jimmy's headed to Colorado from Australia for the summer. Awesome. Which bike do you bring? Road, gravel, or hardtail? And you get one event leave pass. What should you do? Obviously, James and I are both in Colorado. I think it kind of. What do you think, James? It kind of depends on what part of Colorado you're in. Really,
I actually,
like if you're down where I am,
just asked him where in Colorado.
Yeah, so like if you're down where I am in Durango, you bring a mountain bike.
Golden mountain bike for sure.
Although the gravel riding there is pretty damn good too. Road and gravel riding is pretty damn good.
So
I don't know. I would
bring
start,
all the bikes.
Can you bring more than one? Can you bring 3 bikes? I think you could basically. I think you would really enjoy some big days on a gravel bike out of Golden. There's some incredible riding down there. That said, there's also some really good mountain biking, like right out of town. And maybe you could like pick your favorite and rent the other one a couple times or something. That could work.
Well, one thing I will say, he said he's going to be in Golden. Golden is just about a half hour south of me here in Boulder. The one thing about mountain biking in Golden is it's quite rough. It's quite rocky. And Jimmy said that he is going to be bringing a hardtail. And I don't know, a hardtail in Golden could be kind of tough.
Put Cushcore in.
Cushcore and like 2 6s.
So maybe bring a gravel bike and rent a trail mountain bike for a few days.
You certainly could. Yeah. And there are I mean, the companies aren't really they're not really set up to do this, but Alchemy is based in Golden now. Yeti is in Golden. It's certainly possible that you could rent/demo some bikes while you're down there. That's certainly a possibility. But I don't know if you're going to be there for a whole summer. For me, I don't know. I feel like a hardtail would be more versatile because while there is a lot of good gravel riding down there, you can certainly do that on a hardtail. But however, you cannot take a gravel bike on any of the good trails in Golden. No way.
No chance. We're down to 4%. So I'm going to cut it off.
All right.
We're going to cut
Sounds
it off
good.
right there. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your questions today. We one of these weeks soon, maybe we do next week or the week after, we're going to do an entire episode full of questions. We'll take a whole bunch beforehand. Obviously, you'll have to be in the member Discord to participate in that. So if you're not already a member, head over to escapecollective.cc and sign up. As a reminder, that is how we fund this entire operation. The three of us here sitting in front of you, that's how we get to actually make a living doing this, which is wild. And without all of the member support, then we just cease to exist. So if you haven't signed up already, please do so.
And by we, Kelly means Escape Collective, not we as people.
Yes.
To be clear.
Unfortunate. To be very clear. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening this week. We'll be back with another one next week. And keep an eye out. If you are a member, keep an eye out for our next live show, probably in 2 or 3 weeks' time. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.